Over the last decade, analog camera hype has skyrocketed, but that hype hasn't necessarily been distributed fairly. Some of the best cameras have been utterly eclipsed by those that are more trendy or aesthetically appealing. Here in the shadow of the Mamiya 7s, Contax T2s, and Leica M6s of the world lives the EOS 3, the most phenomenally capable 35mm film camera I have ever used. The EOS 3 is a 35mm Canon single-lens reflex body that first hit the market in 1998. It has 45 autofocus points, auto-exposure bracketing, auto-winds and advances your film, and sports a maximum 1/8000th of a second shutter speed at up to 4.3 frames per second without a booster. So what is the EOS 3 and what makes it so great? Well, I think to answer that question, we need to define what this camera isn't. It's not retro. It's not a novelty, nor is it the fully manual tactile film experience. But that means it's also not clunky, difficult to use, or limited in features. Maybe this is a bold statement, but in my humble opinion, the EOS 3 is the pinnacle of 35mm analog SLR excellence, for many reasons. But there's one that seems to be the #1 talking point, so let's address that first. The EOS 3 is an EF mount Canon camera. One of my gripes with analog cameras is the lens selection. Depending on the camera, lenses are often either expensive or hard to find. With an EF mount, they don't need to be either. Canon has been making EF glass since the 80s, and it's just about everywhere. I don't even shoot Canon digital anymore, and I even had a 28-75 f2.8 and a 35mm f2 EF just sitting around. But even if you don't worry. Canon has made over 80 different EF lenses and sold over 130 million units worldwide, which is a crazy number that doesn't even take into account the third-party options, adapters, or EF glass you may already own. Shoot Canon already? Your EF glass will work flawlessly, image stabilization, autofocus, and all. So yeah, the EOS 3 opens the door to an enormous variety of lenses. And when you're shooting film, the lenses and the stock are far more important than the camera body in determining the final result of your image. And when the majority of analog photographers are shooting at a 35mm focal length or equivalent field of view on other formats, you can easily set your work apart by simply switching lenses.
All right, you get it. Lots of lenses, right? But what about the camera? Because that's what this video is really about. Well, if you ever wanted to shoot 35mm film and wake up your entire family in the process, then this is the camera for you. It may be loud, but it's pretty satisfying. But you know what else that you probably didn't know, but that this camera does do, is that it has eye control autofocus. What? Yes, you heard me. Eye control autofocus, as in like this camera registers where you're looking through the viewfinder and adjusts your autofocus point accordingly. Which sounds kind of gimmicky until you calibrate it a few times and realize that it actually works pretty well. I don't know why they discontinued this feature. Could you imagine if modern cameras had that ability? Like, this camera is 30 years old. I'm sure we could do a way better job now. So most analog cameras give you one of two metering options, meter or no meter. The EOS 3, however, has multi-spot metering, which means that you can take up to 8 spot meter readings that will be averaged together to give you the optimum averaged exposure, which is pretty cool because you no longer have to really stress out about those super contrasty scenarios and like think, do I expose for this, or how do I find the middle ground? You can just take a meter reading for the highlights, meter reading for the shadows, and then the camera will go, oh, this is the median exposure, and then you go. Which isn't something that I use all the time, but it is super nice to have in those run and gun scenarios where you don't want to be deliberating about your settings too much, but you still want to make sure that you get the right shot.
Now, all of this is great, and these are all strong arguments for getting one of these cameras of your own. But there's one feature that makes the EOS 3 for me, and it may not be the one that you expect. Multiple exposures. I say multiple exposures instead of double exposures because you can shoot up to 9 on a single frame, which is kind of overkill. I don't know when you would ever want to expose a single image 9 times, but the functionality is there.
Now for me, that's really the cherry on top because I'm falling more and more in love with multiple exposure photography. And I think a big reason of that is this camera and how easy they are to shoot on this camera. On a whole lot of other analog cameras, you have to basically run the film through the camera twice in order to get that second exposure, which is a big commitment because then you're doing basically the whole roll double exposure. And it doesn't allow you the flexibility to work on one double exposure at a time, which this does because you basically put it in multiple exposure mode and then you shoot both exposures back to back, which basically gives you full creative control over each multiple exposed image. It means that you can individually craft each exposure to tell a more compelling story, and that is the shit.
So it's not old school, at least not in the trendy kind of way. It's not the kind of camera you get for the vintage aesthetic or for the tactile experience of shooting film. This is the camera you get if you want versatility, ease of use, and results. The lens selection, ergonomics, high shutter speed, multi-spot metering, and all the other bells and whistles I didn't touch on all work together in harmony and create a shooting experience that's exciting and engaging in any scenario. Because what it may lack in manual appeal, it makes up for in premium features. Ones that allow you full expression of your vision on demand. Want to shoot 400 speed wide open in direct sunlight? Go for it. Feel like shooting some studio flash portraiture, double exposures, and sports photography today? Do it all on the same roll. Whatever it is, the EOS 3 will help you capture each quickly, reliably, and satisfyingly. The only downside that I can see is that it doesn't have that highly prized retro appeal. But now that I think about it, that's probably a good thing, because if it did, these would have all been bought up a long time ago and would now be going for a small fortune on eBay. So if the EOS 3 sounds like your kind of camera, now's the time to get one, before they get swept up just like the Contax T2s, Mamiya 7s, and Leica M6s of the world and triple in price.